I was 8 years old when I realized that not all families were like mine. I was at a friend's house and her parents were laughing together while they cooked dinner. It felt like I was watching a movie, something completely unreal. My house was different. My dad was always angry. He would come home late, reeking of alcohol, and the first thing he did was yell. It didn't matter what the reason was: dishes in the sink, the TV too loud, or my little brother playing with his toys on the floor. If he was in the mood to scream, he would find something to scream about. Mom tried her best to shield us, but she was exhausted. She worked 2 jobs, and when she wasn't working, she was cleaning or cooking, trying to keep things in order. I could see the worry lines on her face getting deeper each day, her hands shaking whenever Dad raised his voice. One night I heard them fighting after we went to bed. I was curled up with my little brother, who had started crying. I knew better than to go downstairs, but I could hear everything through the walls. Dad was shouting about money, accusing Mom of things I didn't understand. Then there was a loud crash, and Mom screamed. It was the first time I heard her cry like that loud, desperate sobs that I'll never forget. That's when I realized it wasn't just me and my brother who were scared. Mom was scared too. But she stayed, day after day, because she thought she had no other choice. She used to tell me everything would get better, that Dad was just going through a rough patch. But I could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe that anymore. I started spending more time at school, staying late in the library or finding excuses to hang out at friends' houses. Anything to avoid going home. But no matter how late I stayed out, I always had to return. I hated the silence when I walked in, the tension so thick it was like you could choke on it. I remember the day Mom finally packed our bags. She had a bruise on her cheek, and when she saw me staring, she just gave me a sad smile. "We're leaving, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. We stuffed as much as we could into the car and drove off in the middle of the night, not knowing where we'd end up. That was 3 years ago. We've moved around a lot since then, never staying in one place for too long. Mom says we're free now, that things are better. And in some ways they are. But sometimes, when the house is too quiet, I can still hear the echoes of my dad's voice, the sound of my mom crying in the dark. And I wonder if those memories will ever really go away. I'll never forget the look in my dad's eyes when he came home late from work, still in his police uniform, with that cold, distant stare. I'd be sitting in my room, trying to keep quiet, trying not to give him a reason to notice me. But no matter how careful I was, he always found something to be angry about. Dad wasn't always like that. I remember when I was younger, he used to play catch with me in the backyard, laugh with me, and even tuck me into bed. But then Mom died in that car accident, and something inside him snapped. It was like he stopped being my dad and became this stranger who wore his face. The first time he hit me, I didn't even know how to react. I was only 8, and I was confused, scared, and hurt. He was drunk, slurring his words about how everything was my fault, how I reminded him of her. The back of his hand struck my face so hard I fell to the ground. I remember the taste of blood in my mouth and the shock that froze me in place. But that was just the beginning. Over the years, the beatings became more frequent. Sometimes it was because I left my toys out, other times because I didn't do well enough in school, or because dinner wasn't ready when he came home. It didn't matter what I did or didn't do. The result was always the same: me on the floor, trying not to cry too loud because I knew it would only make things worse. I learned to hide the bruises, to lie to teachers and friends about where they came from. I fell off my bike, I'd say, or I tripped in the hallway. But no matter how good I got at lying, I couldn't lie to myself. I hated living in fear, hated the man my dad had become, but I didn't know what to do. He was a cop who would believe me if I told the truth. One night, when I was about 14, I finally snapped. Dad had come home in a rage, yelling about some bad day he had at work. I could tell by the way he was swaying that he'd been drinking. When he grabbed my arm, I yanked it free and bolted out the door. I didn't know where I was going, I just ran. I ended up at my Aunt Lisa's house. She was Mom's sister, and she'd always been kind to me, but I never told her what was going on. That night, though, I couldn't keep it in anymore. I broke down, crying as I told her everything. She held me close, stroking my hair, telling me it wasn't my fault. For the first time in years, I felt safe. The next day, Aunt Lisa did something I'll never forget. She marched me back to the house and we faced my dad together. I was terrified, but she wasn't. She stood her ground, telling him he had no right to treat me the way he did, that he was supposed to protect me, not hurt me. Dad tried to fight back, shouting and threatening her, but Aunt Lisa wouldn't back down. After that, she filed a case against him. I didn't understand all the legal stuff, but I remember the fear in my dad's eyes when the papers were served. It took months of court hearings and meetings with social workers, but in the end, Aunt Lisa won custody of me. I moved in with her, and slowly, the fear that had been my constant companion began to fade. Dad lost his job, and I heard he left town not long after. I haven't seen him since, and to be honest, I'm okay with that. Living with Aunt Lisa isn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it's a world away from the hell I used to live in. I'm starting to feel like a normal kid again, like maybe, just maybe, I can finally leave the past behind. I stood there in the rain, the cold drops mingling with my tears, watching as the coffin was slowly lowered into the ground. My heart ached in a way I never knew was possible. My 5-year-old son Jacob was clinging to my leg, his small hand grasping mine tightly. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew enough to feel the weight of the loss. The world had become a darker place for both of us. It all began 2 years ago when my husband Mark was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors were blunt, there wasn't much time. I remember sitting in that sterile, white office, the words terminal and incurable echoing in my ears like a cruel chant. Mark was only 33, and we had just started our lives together. We had dreams, plans to watch Jacob grow up, to travel, to grow old together. But cancer didn't care about our plans. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's health deteriorated rapidly. He went from being the strong, vibrant man I fell in love with to a ghost of himself. He was always tired, always in pain. His once bright eyes became hollow, and his body withered away. But through it all, he tried to be strong for us, for Jacob. He'd smile through the pain, tell jokes to make Jacob laugh, even when laughing made him wince in agony. He wanted Jacob to remember him as the dad who loved him more than anything in the world, not the sick man who was fading away. But as much as Mark tried to hide it, Jacob could see the truth. He could see his daddy slipping away, day by day. He'd ask me questions that shattered my heart into a million pieces. Mommy, why is daddy always tired? Mommy, when will daddy get better? I never had the right words. How do you explain to a child that his father is dying? How do you make sense of something that doesn't make sense at all? One night, a few weeks before Mark passed, he asked me to promise him something. We were lying in bed, his frail body pressed against mine. I could feel every rib, every bone. His breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a pain deeper than anything physical. Promise me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Promise me you'll take care of Jacob. Don't let him forget me. I nodded, choking back tears. I promise, Mark. I'll do everything I can to make sure he remembers you. He'll always know how much you loved him. Mark smiled weakly, his hand reaching out to cup my cheek. You're so strong, Anna. You'll be okay. You both will be, just don't let him forget me. Those were the last words he ever said to me. The day Mark died was the hardest day of my life. I held his hand as he took his last breath, watched as the light left his eyes. There was no more pain, no more suffering, but the emptiness he left behind was unbearable. I felt like a part of me had died with him. Jacob didn't understand at first. He kept asking when Daddy was coming back, why he wasn't waking up. I tried to explain, but how do you tell a 5-year-old that his father is never coming home, that he's gone forever? Jacob cried for hours, begging for his daddy to come back. I held him close, my own tears soaking into his hair, whispering words of comfort that felt hollow and meaningless. In the weeks that followed, I tried to keep Mark's memory alive, just like I promised. I told Jacob stories about his dad, showed him pictures and videos, tried to make sure he never forgot the man who loved him so much. But it was hard, so much harder than I ever imagined. Every time I looked at Jacob, I saw Mark. Every laugh, every smile, every little thing he did reminded me of the man I lost. It was like a knife twisting in my heart over and over again. I was struggling, barely holding it together. And then, to make matters worse, Mark's brother, Tom, and his wife, Lisa, started showing up more and more. At first, they seemed supportive, offering to help with Jacob, bringing over meals, and trying to be there for us. But soon, their visits became intrusive, and their concern turned into something else entirely. Tom started questioning my decisions. Why wasn't I doing this or that with Jacob? Why wasn't I putting him in therapy? Why wasn't I dealing with my grief better? He'd say things like, "Mark wouldn't want you to wallow in sadness, Anna," or "Jacob needs stability, maybe it's time to move on." Every word felt like a dagger to the heart. How could they expect me to just move on? How could they think they knew what was best for my son? One day, Tom and Lisa came over and sat me down, their faces serious. "Anna," Tom began, "we've been talking and we think Jacob would be better off with us for a while." I stared at them, not comprehending. "What do you mean?" "Look, you're not in a good place right now. You're grieving, and that's understandable, but Jacob needs stability, he needs routine. We can give him that." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "Jacob is my son."
He belongs with me.
Lisa tried to reach out to me, her voice soft and patronizing. "Anna, we're not trying to take him from you. We just think, no." I shouted, standing up so fast the chair nearly toppled over. "He's my son. You don't get to decide what's best for him." The conversation escalated into a heated argument. Tom accused me of being too emotional, of not thinking clearly, of not being fit to take care of Jacob in my state. Lisa tried to calm things down, but I could see it in their eyes. They had already made up their minds. They thought I was incapable of being a good mother, and they were trying to take my son away from me. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Tom and Lisa filed for temporary custody, claiming I was unfit due to my grief and emotional state. I was blindsided, devastated, and terrified. They used every little thing against me, every tear I shed, every time I struggled to get out of bed in the morning. They painted me as a broken woman who couldn't take care of her child, who couldn't be trusted to raise him on her own. The court battles were exhausting, draining every last bit of strength I had left. I fought with everything in me to keep Jacob, to honor the promise I made to Mark, but the more I fought, the more it felt like I was losing. The legal system was cold and uncaring, reducing my grief to a checklist of symptoms and behaviors. I was terrified of losing the only piece of Mark had left. In the end, the judge granted Tom and Lisa temporary custody, citing my need for emotional recovery. I couldn't believe it. My world crumbled around me as they took Jacob away, his small hand reaching out for me as he cried, "Mommy, don't let them take me." I collapsed on the courtroom floor, my heart shattering into a million pieces. I had failed. I had failed Mark. I had failed Jacob. I had failed as a mother. The emptiness that had been growing inside me since Mark's death threatened to swallow me whole. Weeks turned into months, and I was barely functioning. Every day without Jacob was a fresh wound, a reminder of everything I had lost. I tried to get better, tried to heal, but how could I when the only thing that mattered was taken from me? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day came when I was allowed to see Jacob again. I had fought to regain my stability, to prove that I could be the mother he needed. As I walked into Tom and Lisa's house, my heart pounded in my chest. Jacob ran to me, his little arms wrapping around my legs, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was tinged with fear. Jacob seemed different, quieter, more reserved. He didn't talk about his dad as much, didn't ask for the stories I used to tell him. It was like they were slowly erasing Mark from his memory, trying to replace him with something else. I held Jacob close, tears streaming down my face. I promised him, over and over, that I would never let him go again. That I would fight with everything I had to bring him home, to keep Mark's memory alive in his heart. But deep down, I knew the scars from this battle would never fully heal for either of us. The day I left for college was the hardest day of my life. I had always known it would come. My mom had been talking about it since I was a kid, encouraging me to dream big, to reach for the stars, to make something of myself. But knowing something and living it are two very different things. We lived in a small town where everyone knew each other, where Friday nights were for football games and Sunday mornings were for church. My mom raised me on her own after my dad left when I was 3. I don't remember much about him, just that he wasn't around and that my mom never talked about him unless I asked. She always said we were better off without him, and I believed her. She was everything to me, my mom, my dad, my best friend. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and despite how tired she always was, she never missed a single one of my games, my school events, or anything that was important to me. When I got accepted into a good college in a city a few hours away, I was thrilled. It was what I had always wanted, a chance to get out of our small town, to experience something bigger, to chase the dreams my mom had always pushed me towards. But as the day of departure grew closer, that excitement was slowly overtaken by a deep, aching sadness. I didn't want to leave her behind. The morning I was supposed to leave, my mom woke me up early. She had made my favorite breakfast pancakes with extra syrup, bacon, and scrambled eggs. We sat in the kitchen, eating in silence. I could tell she was trying to hold it together, just like I was. Every few minutes, I'd catch her glancing at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. After breakfast, we loaded my bags into the car. My mom had insisted on driving me to the city and helping me get settled in the apartment I had rented. The drive was long and quiet. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach that tightened with every mile we traveled. My mom kept glancing over at me, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. When we finally arrived at the apartment, I felt like I was in a daze. The city was loud and overwhelming, so different from the quiet life I had known. My mom helped me carry my things upstairs, and we spent the afternoon unpacking. She folded my clothes, set up my bed, and stocked the tiny kitchen with the groceries we had brought from home. By the time we were done, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. My mom looked around the apartment, her eyes lingering on the bare walls and the small window that overlooked the street below. "This is a nice place," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. "You'll do great here, I know you will." I nodded, unable to find the words. I could feel the tears burning behind my eyes, but I didn't want to cry. I wanted to be strong, for her and for myself. We stood there in the middle of the room, neither of us knowing what to do next. Finally, my mom stepped forward and pulled me into a tight hug. She was smaller than me now. I had outgrown her a few years ago, but in that moment, she felt like the strongest person in the world. I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You've worked so hard for this, but it's okay to be scared." "I'm scared too." I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They spilled over, soaking into her shirt as I clung to her. "I don't want to leave you, Mom," I choked out. What if I can't do this?" She pulled back slightly, just enough to look me in the eyes. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was smiling, a sad, bittersweet smile that broke my heart. "You can do this," she said firmly. "You're stronger than you know. And I'll always be here for you, no matter what. You can call me anytime, day or night. I'll be here." I nodded, trying to take comfort in her words. But all I could think about was how empty our house would feel without me in it, how lonely she would be. I knew she had friends, people who cared about her, but I had always been her world, just like she was mine. Eventually, it was time for her to go. We walked down to the car in silence, both of us dreading the inevitable goodbye. She hugged me one last time before getting in the driver's seat. I stood on the sidewalk watching as she started the engine, my heart pounding in my chest. She rolled down the window, her eyes red from crying. "I love you, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Call me when you get settled, okay?" "I will, Mom. I love you too." She gave me one last, lingering look before she pulled away, the car slowly disappearing down the street. I stood there long after she was gone, the city bustling around me, feeling like the loneliest person in the world. The apartment that had seemed so exciting just a few days ago now felt cold and empty, a stark reminder of the life I had left behind. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone clutched in my hand. I wanted to call her, to tell her how much I missed her already, but I didn't want to make it harder for her. I knew she was probably sitting at home doing the same thing, missing me just as much. I spent the first few weeks in the city feeling lost. Classes were overwhelming. The city was too big, too fast. I didn't know anyone, and I found myself retreating into my room after class, avoiding the new world I was supposed to embrace. The only thing that kept me going was our nightly phone calls. My mom would tell me about her day, ask about mine, and I'd lie, telling her that everything was going great, that I was making friends, that I was happy. I didn't want her to worry, didn't want her to know how much I was struggling. But she knew. Of course, she knew. She always knew when something was wrong. One night, after I had been particularly quiet on the phone, she asked me, "Are you okay, honey?" "Really okay?" And just like that, the floodgates opened. I told her everything, how lonely I was, how scared, how much I missed her and home. I felt like a failure, like I wasn't cut out for this new life. She listened patiently, letting me pour my heart out. When I was done, she said softly, "It's okay to feel this way. Change is hard and it's okay to be scared. But you have to remember why you're there, why you worked so hard to get there. You're going to make it, I know you are. And I'm always here, just a phone call away. We'll get through this together." Her words gave me the strength I needed to keep going. Slowly, I started to adjust. I made friends, got more comfortable in my classes, and even started exploring the city. It wasn't easy, but every time I felt like giving up, I'd remember my mom's voice, her unwavering belief in me. But no matter how well I adjusted, there was always a part of me that felt empty, a part that missed her more than I could ever put into words. The hardest part of growing up wasn't the responsibility, the new experiences, or even the challenges. It was leaving behind the person who had been my whole world for so long. And every time I visited home, every time I hugged her again, I was reminded of just how much I had left behind. I'll never forget the sound of the glass shattering. It wasn't just any glass. It was the last piece of the wedding china my mom had managed to keep intact after all those years. It had survived the move, the countless dinner parties, and even that one time my dad had accidentally knocked over the cabinet it was displayed in, but it couldn't survive my brother's rage. That day is etched into my memory, not because of the shattered glass itself, but because it was the first time I realized that our family had truly fallen apart. I was too young to understand the full extent of what was happening back then. My dad had died when I was just 4 years old, too young to really grasp the permanence of death, too young to feel the grief that had enveloped my family like a thick fog. But my brother, who was 11 at the time, wasn't so lucky. He felt everything, and the weight of it all nearly crushed him. He was my hero before all this happened. I looked up to him like only a little sister could. He was my big brother, my protector, my guide in this confusing world. But after Dad died, something in him broke. It wasn't an immediate thing. It was more like watching a glass slowly crack under pressure until it finally shatters into 1,000 pieces. And when he shattered, so did our family. My brother withdrew from everyone and everything.
He locked himself away in his room, refusing to come out except when absolutely necessary.
He didn't speak unless he had to, and when he did, it was usually in anger. The depression took root in him, twisting his once gentle nature into something dark and unrecognizable. My mom did everything she could to try and reach him, to pull him out of that dark place, but nothing worked. And that's when the fights began. At first, they were just arguments, tense conversations behind closed doors that I wasn't supposed to hear. But as time went on, the arguments turned into full-blown screaming matches. I remember hiding under the kitchen table during one of those fights, my hands pressed tightly over my ears as my brother and mom screamed at each other. I don't remember what the fight was about, but I do remember the sound of my brother's fist hitting the wall. The whole house seemed to shake with the force of his anger. And then there was the glass. I was sitting in the living room, clutching my favorite stuffed animal, when I heard the crash. I didn't know what it was at first, but the silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the noise itself. I remember peeking around the corner and seeing my brother standing in the kitchen, his chest heaving and his eyes wild with fury. My mom was standing across from him, her face pale and her hands trembling. The broken pieces of the wedding china lay scattered across the floor between them. That was the moment I realized that things would never go back to the way they were before. My brother's anger wasn't just directed at my mom. Sometimes it found its way to me as well. He would say things cruel, cutting things that I didn't understand at the time but would keep me awake at night, wondering what I had done to deserve them. He'd push me away when I tried to hug him, telling me to leave him alone, that he didn't want to be around me. I was too young to fully comprehend that he was lashing out because he was hurting. All I knew was that my brother, the person I loved most in the world, had turned into someone I didn't recognize. And that hurt more than anything. It wasn't long before my brother stopped coming home altogether. He started staying with a friend, and just like that, he was gone. It was as if he had disappeared from our lives entirely. My mom didn't talk about him much during that time, and I didn't dare ask. It was as if the mere mention of his name would bring back all the pain and chaos we had been living with for so long. Without my brother around, the house was eerily quiet. My mom and I fell into a routine, and on the surface, things seemed almost normal. But there was always an emptiness hanging over us, a reminder that our family was incomplete. The years passed, and I grew older, but the distance between my brother and me only seemed to widen. We were like strangers living in the same world, but on completely different paths. Occasionally, he would come home for a few days, but those visits were always tense, filled with awkward silences and forced small talk. He would barely acknowledge me, and when he did, it was as if he was looking right through me, like I wasn't really there. I tried to push down the hurt, tried to convince myself that I didn't care, that I didn't need him. But deep down, I missed him terribly. I missed the way things used to be before everything went wrong. I missed my big brother. It wasn't until I was a teenager myself that I began to understand the depth of what my brother had been going through all those years. By then, he had moved back home, but things between us were still strained. We had started to reconnect in small ways, shared meals, brief conversations, but there was still so much left unsaid, so much pain that lingered between us. One evening after dinner, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the spot where the wedding china had once been displayed. My brother walked in and sat down across from me. We sat in silence for a while, the air heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked up at him, surprised. It was the first time he had ever apologized for anything. "For what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "For everything," he said, his eyes filled with regret. "For the way I treated you, for the things I said, for not being there when you needed me." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how many nights I had cried myself to sleep because of him. But another part of me, a bigger part, just wanted to forgive him. "I was just a kid," he continued, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to handle everything, losing Dad, losing myself. I didn't mean to take it out on you." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I'm trying to be better," he said, looking at me with an intensity that took me by surprise. "I don't want to be that person anymore." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. We sat in silence for a long time after that. But it was a different kind of silence, one that felt more like a beginning than an end. That conversation was a turning point for us. It didn't magically fix everything, but it opened the door for healing, for rebuilding the relationship that had been so badly damaged. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wondered if we would ever truly be okay again. But slowly, bit by bit, we began to find our way back to each other. We started talking more, really talking, not just the surface-level conversations we had been having for years. He told me about the pain he had been carrying, about how lost he had felt after Dad died. He told me about the guilt he had felt for abandoning us, for abandoning me. And for the first time, I told him about how much his absence had hurt me, how much I had missed him. It was painful to dredge up all those old wounds, but it was also necessary. We needed to confront the past in order to move forward. And as we did, something incredible began to happen. We started to heal. There were setbacks, of course. Old habits die hard, and there were times when we would slip back into the same patterns of anger and resentment. But each time we found our way back to each other, a little stronger, a little more understanding than before. I began to see glimpses of the brother I had once adored. He wasn't the same person he had been before Dad died, but then again, neither was I. We had both been through so much, and it had changed us in ways that we were still trying to understand. But there was also something new between us, a bond forged in the fire of our shared pain. A bond that was stronger than anything we had before. One day, while we were sitting in the backyard, my brother turned to me and said, "You know, I love you, right?" I nodded, tears springing to my eyes. "I love you too," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. It was such a simple exchange, but it meant everything to me. For so long, I had doubted whether we could ever find our way back to each other, whether we could ever truly be siblings again. But in that moment, I knew that we were on the right path. Our relationship is still a work in progress. There are still days when the past feels too heavy, when the memories of what we went through threaten to pull us back into that dark place. But there is also hope, a hope that we can continue to heal, to grow, to become the siblings we were always meant to be. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, I find myself staring at the empty spot where the wedding china used to be. I used to see it as a symbol of everything we had lost: our family, our innocence, our happiness. But now I see it differently. I see it as a reminder that even the most shattered things can be pieced back together, that even the most broken relationships can be healed. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's possible. And that's what I hold on to, that possibility, that hope. Because no matter how dark things get, there is always a way forward, always a chance for healing, for redemption. My brother and I still have a long way to go, but we're walking that path together now. And that, more than anything, gives me hope.